Sure. My name is Dan Mills, D-A-N-M-I-L-L-S.
And now this one's for the documentary. Could you just say, hi, my name is Dan Mills?
Hi, my name is Dan Mills.
All right, Mr. Mills. Now, were you born in Muncie?
No, I was born, want to start over?
Sure.
I didn't rephrase the question.
No,
So.
go ahead and just, where were you born at, Mr. Mills?
I was born in Winchester, Indiana.
Okay. How did you come to Muncie?
Well, I grew up in farmland, and I ended up, of course, Muncie was the growing up in the 50s and 60s. Muncie was a major center for East Central Indiana. So we always came to Muncie to shop. We came to Muncie to the doctors. We came to Muncie to the hospital. Came to Muncie for what entertainment there was at the time. So.
When you were younger, did you know of BorgWarner? Was it something that was on the radar? Was it important in Muncie? As a kid, did you know about BorgWarner?
As a kid, I was very much aware of BorgWarner, and it's, I guess I don't know so much as a kid its influence in the community, but that I later come to understand. But my dad worked at BorgWarner. I remember waiting in the car in 1953 outside the plant, downtown, Plant 1, waiting for a verdict as to whether he was going to get hired or not. I also had 3 uncles and a few other relatives that worked at the plant, so I was very much aware of BorgWarner.
So when you were younger, did you envision yourself someday working for them? Or how'd you come about? How'd you get the job at BorgWarner? Did your dad help you out? Uncles?
Yeah, no, interesting. The way I got my job at BorgWarner was, totally on my own. At the time, after I graduated from college, I went to Purdue and obtained a mechanical engineering degree. I worked for General Motors for 10.5 years, both in the Detroit area and at Delco Remy and Anderson. And in 1981, I made the switch to leave Delco Remy at that time and came over to work for BorgWarner.
And how long did you work at BorgWarner?
I worked at BorgWarner for 18.5 years. And I actually had 2 different stints of working at BorgWarner. I worked for them from 1981 to 1996, and then I left in 1996, went to another company, came back to BorgWarner in 2001.
And when did you finally, you with them right up to the end, or?
I was not with BorgWarner up until the end. After coming back in 2000, I worked for about 4 years for BorgWarner, and I left and went to work for another company in 2004.
The company you work for now, is that a union shop?
The company I work for now is a non-union shop.
Now, you were never a member of the union, is that correct, or were you?
I was never a member of the union while working at BorgWarner.
So, if you can you compare the two jobs, the job you have now and the job when you had at BorgWarner? Were there tensions that were? What was it like working in a union shop versus a non-union shop? Even though you weren't a part of the union, was it different? Is it different?
I can contrast my experience of working in a union and non-union shop. Like I say, I did work at BorgWarner, it was union. I also worked at General Motors, and it was union. Then I worked for another company in Iowa that was a non-union shop, also predominantly non-union. And I currently work for a non-union shop. So yeah, there are differences. I would say this, the General Motors experience, the union was much more demanding, had many more rules that would prohibit, say, salaried people from, quote, doing certain activity that was considered to be bargaining unit work. and you would be called on that very quickly at General Motors. BorgWarner did not have nearly as many of those, I would call, non-productive kind of agreements that would prohibit people from, say, picking up a part and walking from one area of the plant to another area of the plant to explore, to measure, to have the part measured, or to find out what might be wrong with it. You couldn't do that at General Motors. You could do that at BorgWarner. Obviously, at any non-union shop, you don't have to worry about those kind of things. But in general, I would say that the labor management relations at BorgWarner were pretty participative. Yeah, we had our moments, the strike of 1989 in particular, but you know, for the most part, when we were in the building working and the contracts were settled, everybody worked together pretty well.
Now, during 1989, can you think of any specific stories or instances that you could tell us about in terms of just the tension, to demonstrate the tension that occurred during these strikes?
Well, during the strike of '89, it was obviously you were met with tension of a morning when you went through the picket line. And sometimes you could drive right in, and sometimes the picket line would, you know, make you wait out on Kilgore Avenue. Cars would back up for a while. But, you know, people kind of did what their role was, you know. I felt like my role during that time was to help to, certainly you have to support the customer. And so at that time I was working in engineering, and all of the folks working in engineering went out in the shop and worked on the assembly line. But again, it's, you know, it was part of, I understood it, you know, it's the, you know, the union had their role, and their role was to try to negotiate a contract, and they felt like they were not getting anywhere, so their only recourse was to strike. On the other hand, the company, the salaried employees, had a responsibility to the customer to always keep the product flowing to the customer. And so, you know, everybody did what they had to do. And that's, you know, that's about all I can say about it. It was a tough time. It lasted a long time. It was 9 weeks, if I recall. And during a 9-week period, you become the people that you are now doing that job. In other words, a lot of the same kind of pranks and things like that went on out on the shop floor every day. Salaried people do the same thing when they're put into that kind of a position.
So what did you think about working on the floor? Did you like it better than being in an office, or?
Well, far as working on the shop floor versus working in the office, you know, no, I didn't like it better. I mean, that's one reason I chose to go the direction I did with my life. But it was a good experience, and it served me well. Because after the strike of '89, about a year later, I took another job with the company there at Borg, where I was over the manufacturing areas, and I had a different perspective about, you know, what it took to come to work every day and stand out there on your feet, run a machine or run a operation station on an assembly line, and to do that 700 or 800 times a day, or maybe do it, if you're machining parts, maybe a couple thousand times a day. And I have a lot of respect for that, because it takes a certain mindset to be able to get up every day and go into work at a particular point in time that you have to be there when the line starts, and to do that job all day long. And so, you know, it served me well, because later in the years that I had to deal with people that were in that position, I had a little different perspective, and it helped me understand a little bit more about, their side of the story compared to what, quote, the management side might be.
Do you feel like your experience in that regard was fairly common? Did a lot of other people in management also have the same experiences working on the shop floor during certain times? Do you think that helped relations between labor and management, or are you an exception?
All I can do is speak for myself. I mean, I can't really hazard a comment about what other people learned or didn't learn from it. But all I know from my standpoint, it had been a long time. I worked on assembly lines and manufacturing when I was going to college, but it's temporary. And you're going to go back to school in the fall, or you're going to graduate at a certain time, and life's going to change for you. But, after 4 to 6 weeks of doing that work, we had no idea when the strike was going to end and when it was going to be over. And you really kind of became the people who did that job. And you've kind of forgot about what you were doing before, because it was not really all that important compared to serving the customer that had to be served at the time.
Can you describe a little bit about what you did usually do as management? I mean, what did your typical day consist of? How is it different than being on the floor?
From a standpoint of working on the shop floor, when you came in, you had to go right to your job. And if you're working on an assembly line, the assembly line can't start until all 25 or 35 people arrive and are ready there to do their job. And then once it starts, you work for 2 hours, you get a break. You work for 2 more hours, you get a break. You work for 2 more hours, you get a break, and you work for 2 more hours and you go home. On the management side, depending upon whether I was working in engineering, or whether I was working in quality, or whether I was working in manufacturing, would be different, because obviously in the engineering world, you're working on projects, you're working on prototypes, you're working with the customer, you're going to meetings, you're keeping track of where you are on project timing charts. When you're running manufacturing, you come to work and you find out what machines are working today, what machines are not working, what are we going to do to get them fixed, where's my material coming from, are my suppliers giving me good quality parts every day, what are the problems, what do I have to do to get suppliers in here to fix the problem, is the material flowing in, or is there a problem at the supplier to where they can't supply product, and how long am I going to go before I would shut the customer down? Then there's the normal continual improvement things like, what are we doing to change the processes to make it more efficient? What machines are coming in to help that cause? What other activities do we have going on from a move and rearrange to change the manufacturing efficiency of a cell? Quality problems, people problems, not enough people come to work, so you got to get people from another area of the plant. You got to borrow them from an area that's maybe a little more flexible as opposed to an assembly line. I mean, when you have somebody who doesn't come in on an assembly line, you've got to go rob people from a parts manufacturing area, or from the crib, or from the quality department, or somewhere, because the assembly line has to run. And so, I guess I would summarize it by saying this: when you were working in the management and the manufacturing of the product on a daily basis, your job was very urgent and very important. If you were working in engineering, your job was very important, but it was not so urgent. You had more time to develop your products, to set your plans and do everything, but everything has to happen. When you have to make 5,000 transfer cases or 4,000 transfer cases a day like we did a lot, you don't have a lot of time to make decisions, to not make a decision. You got to make that decision and move on with life and make the day happen.
Do you mind running through some of the jobs that you did do while at BorgWarner? Titles, just so we kind of have an idea of what you were into.
Well, I was while at BorgWarner, I was an engineering manager started out in the marine and industrial area. The marine and industrial product line left Muncie probably in the early 1980s and moved to a different location out in Massachusetts, I think it was. From there, I moved into engineering for manual transmissions. It was a great job during the late 80s. Did various different other jobs in engineering, getting as high as director of engineering. I then moved to a different location out in Massachusetts, I think it was. From there, I moved into engineering for manual transmissions. It was a great job during the late 80s. Did various different other jobs in engineering, getting as high as director of engineering. I then moved into the manufacturing world, where I was director of manufacturing for four-wheel drive transfer cases, and that was a very challenging job. It was a time during the boom and growth of the sport utility market in the early 90s through the mid 90s, and we just couldn't make enough transfer cases throughout that whole period of time, it seemed. And so those were, some of the. I also was director of quality and manufacturing engineering at a later time. So had a lot of good experiences. Learned an awful lot. The products that BorgWarner made were not trivial. They were very difficult parts to make, using lots and lots of high technology processes, and I saw the plant change from machines that had to be hand loaded, one at a time, with machines that didn't have very good guards around them, so chips were flying everywhere. From places to where the plant housekeeping, there was coolants and oils that were all over the floor, and there was sawdust to soak it up, things like that. To we revitalized the plant, cleaned it up, bought new machines that were totally enclosed. They were all CNC programmable, and it really transformed into a much more modern kind of manufacturing, and that was not all that uncommon for all companies during that time, because the computer numerically controlled machine, CNC machine, totally changed manufacturing during the 80s and 90s.
With all this constant improvement, why do you think BorgWarner lost its competitive edge in Muncie, or Warner Gear?
It's a very, very good question, as to how or why, or if they actually did lose their competitive advantage in Muncie, Indiana. Obviously, BorgWarner changed. They were way ahead of General Motors. Obviously, BorgWarner didn't go bankrupt. General Motors eventually did. But I think one of the reasons that BorgWarner was ahead of their time, so to speak, was that the management there we had quarterly all employee meetings, and we told people what was going on. And not everybody believed it, certainly. But I'll tell you one thing, I never told them anything that wasn't the truth. And, people, had different levels of trust for different people in management. But I think, we explained to people that, you have to make a profit. If you don't make a profit, you're not going to be there. And so that was kind of the premise that a lot of contracts through the 80s and 90s were negotiated on. And I think BorgWarner was winning the ball game up until the mid to late 90s. A couple of things happened. Number one, the car companies, Ford and General Motors, were demanding massive rollback in prices from all their suppliers. And if you didn't give the price reduction, there was always a competitor who would. There was basically two major competitors for transfer cases in the United States, and then one smaller player. The smaller player dropped out, and so it came down to the two big guys, and they basically were bidding against each other continuously for the same work. And if the car companies could get a price reduction from the other guy, you either had to match it or you lost it. So pricing was one thing, because the prices went down a huge amount. I would say over the years that I worked there, the prices reduced 20 to 30%. That was one thing so that's not so much a question of losing your competitive edge, but it's a matter of, it's a way that the company then depletes their profits. Then I think as we moved into the latter half of the 90s, and certainly in the 2000s, we are now in a global economy. And there are people in China who will do the work that the people at BorgWarner do for $1 an hour. People at BorgWarner were making $22 an hour roughly when the plant closed. That's a huge differential. And then the people in China, they don't have any benefits to speak of either. Mexico, that was the first place that we really had to worry about. Mexico today is making $4 to $5 an hour all in with all their benefit costs. I don't know what BorgWarner's, because I wasn't there when it closed, so I don't know exactly what their numbers were, but they were probably in the $50 to $60 an hour range. So as the car companies were developing worldwide supply chain strategies, all of the local suppliers, if you didn't have a patented technology that would prohibit somebody from China or Korea or India or somewhere taking your work away, you just can't compete with costs here that support our lifestyle compared to the costs of an emerging nation like China, India, Korea to a lesser extent, and Mexico.
I wanted to return just real briefly to the quarterly meetings that you talked about, the all-employee meetings. At those meetings, do you feel like the labor had a voice there, that they were being heard, their concerns were being heard at those meetings? Who dominated those conversations, if that's it?
The all-employee meetings sometimes were spirited. There was an agenda. I mean, when you're having all employee meetings around the clock. You know, I mean, when people worked midnights, you had to come in on midnights and do the all employee meeting. When they worked afternoons, you came in on afternoons, and on days, you did them on days. And at that time, you know, we might have been meeting with 1,800 to 2,000 people. So the meetings they had a set agenda, and we shared the financials, and we talked a little bit about what was going on in the future with engineering and things like that. Then there was a time for questions and answers, and sometimes the meetings were productive. Sometimes the meetings kind of got a little out of hand. But no, I don't think that the people in the union were getting the answers that they wanted. But I also don't know that I don't know that. I'm not sure what they wanted either, you know.
If we could maybe.
But I would say this: at least there was an attempt, and I do think that there was a lot of. I think there were a lot of people that paid attention in those meetings and heeded what was being said. Some people either didn't understand or didn't want to understand.
So in the early 2000s at these meetings, when you were going over the financials, were you warning the union to ease up on demands for increased benefits because you weren't making any money because of all the things that we've talked about so far, global competition, rollback in prices, and they just didn't want to hear it? Or how did the issue of money come up?
Okay. Well, the all-employee meetings, they were not a forum for negotiating a contract. It was basically to communicate, okay, we have this agreed to contract, these are the rules, and as a result of that, these are our results. And that was really the context of the meeting. It was to educate the workforce as to what was going on financially in the business, and also to educate the workforce as to what was going on for future business opportunities that the company had.
Talking a little bit about the community, one of the things we're trying to get at is the role of BorgWarner in the community, other than just supplying X amount of people with jobs and supporting their families. What kind of things did BorgWarner do to support the community outside of just the jobs? Were there programs? Or I know some of the union guys have talked about blood drives and things.
Sure. Yeah, BorgWarner was, I think, a major contributor to East Central Indiana in general, not just to Muncie, because people from all the surrounding counties would drive into BorgWarner to work because it was a great place to work. And after all, I was here for about 108 years, I believe, if I do my math right. One thing that I noticed when I came to BorgWarner, coming over from Anderson, from General Motors, was there was a much more of a community spirit for the people who worked there. I remember participating in there was a program. It was a little bit like Community Challenge, I think was maybe what it was called. This is going back a ways, and we had like 5K runs, and they had golf. They had golf teams. They had bowling teams. They had softball. Lots of, mostly focused around sporting kind of things, and each company would accumulate points, and so we always participated in those, blood drives, community health fairs, and certainly you don't want to discount the fact that the tax load that the company paid to the community, payment for the assessed value of your capital base in the plant, the income tax, that comes back to both the state and the county, that's paid from the wages. Those things all come back to the community. But in general, and as I walk through Ball Hospital, you'll see, the displays when they made major renovations to the hospital, that you will see that the employees of Warner Gear had a major portion in that contribution. I think there was when we built the YOC, there were some major contributions given to that by BorgWarner. I know that. So in general, I think BorgWarner was a very good supporter of the community, and I think they're sorely going to be missed as an employer, here in East Central Indiana.
Was that a corporate initiative? Did corporate, and I guess it's Michigan now, but did they push that kind of involvement in the community, or was it more kind of the workers here locally that really tried to?
Mm-hmm. I think the decisions to participate in the community kind of activities was totally driven from the local management and the local leadership of the union.
With this community involvement, did you, as a former BorgWarner employee, did you feel a certain status or prestige to be a BorgWarner worker in Muncie? Did you feel that from other people when you met them and you told them where you worked? Were people impressed that you worked at BorgWarner? Were they interested? Was there any kind of?
The question about, how you felt as a BorgWarner employee, your esteem or status in the community, whatever. I don't know so much about that. When you met other people, you work at BorgWarner. I think in years gone by, probably in the 50s or 60s, maybe the 70s, it meant more than it did in the 90s or the early 2000s. As the community was kind of changing from an industrial community to a more of a medical and university-based community, with and as the internet came about, and the technology changed, I'm not so sure in the latter days that it had the kind of esteem, because it was kind of looked at, I think, by most of the community leaders anyway, as they're an old school kind of good staple for the community, but it's not the future. And but I think, all that being said, as an employee, the employees still had a very proud image themselves. And I think, after all, that's more important, is how the people feel who work there, more so than what other people felt like about the people that worked there.
Out of curiosity, what did your father do at BorgWarner? Was he in management, or was he?
My father, when he worked at BorgWarner, was a skilled tradesman.
And when was that?
He worked there, several times. 2 or 3 times, I think. And of course, my dad tells the stories of there used to be so many jobs available. He tells a story about working in Anderson and getting upset with his supervisor, quitting in the middle of the shift, coming back through Muncie, stopping at Warner Gear and working second shift before he ever went home. That's how easy it was to get a job. And I don't know, this must have been in the late 40s, after World War II, or in the early 50s. As strikes would come and layoffs and business ebb and flow, BorgWarner was always a company that, when they lost business, they laid people off. And probably more so than any other community, any other business here in the community. They were very quick to, make cuts if the production was not there. And I think that was a very healthy thing, because it made people, it actually gave some credence to the fact that, if you have business, then you're hiring, and if you're maintaining, then you're not hiring, but you're not laying off. But as soon as you lose business, you've got to start taking the cost down, otherwise you're going to die. And I think that's why BorgWarner was able to survive as long as they did, because they were much more astute at making those kind of changes in a quick manner than other plants. So I think I might have lost the meaning of your question there, because you were asking me about my father, and I remember, growing up, talking, hearing stories about, the steel strike. I think there was a huge steel strike in the country in 1958, 59, someplace in there, that basically there was no steel. And all these companies that worked with steel, like BorgWarner, like Broderick's, like the wire company on the east side of Muncie, like what was formerly Chevrolet plant on 8th Street, the battery plant, they worked with metals, and there were no metals available. And that was a huge strike. I think I must have been 8 or 10 years old, and you really start to feel, when your dad's not, he's searching for work, because there were just no jobs, and not a whole lot like it is today, where when people lose their job, where are they going to go find one? Probably not in the local area. And so it's been a real interesting journey in my 40 years of working in the manufacturing world, to see it go from where it was when I got out of college to where it is today. And it's all been kind of driven by pressures from customers and the world economy. I think that has really made companies. You no longer can you be competitive paying people $25, $30 an hour and another $20 or $25 an hour in benefits. Not when you're competing with China and India and Korea to a lesser extent, and Mexico. Mexico is starting to become an expensive company in the supply, in the customers' car companies' view.
When you decided to go into engineering at Purdue, and I assume you had a talk with your dad maybe about that you when you decided to get into cars, same thing he had done, or the auto industry. Do you have any advice for you, or when he found out you were coming to BorgWarner? Encouragement, discouragement, anything? Did he tell you to be a lawyer?
No, my dad was very, very pleased with my decision to be an engineer, being that he was, a guy who liked to work with his hands, and he was a fairly inventive guy. Always worked on cars, and I developed a love for cars early in my life, and so he was very happy with my decision. Interestingly enough, my dad quit Warner Gear before I went to work there, and he went to work over on 8th Street at Chevrolet. And I don't know, he must have been in his late 50s at that time, with over 20 years of seniority at Warner Gear. He called me up and asked me what I thought I ought to do, and I said, "Dad, those are the kind of questions I'm supposed to ask you, not you ask me." Well, he made that move, and it worked out, I think, well for him. Then I left General Motors. I called him about 5 years later and said, "Hey, I'm going to quit Delco Remy and go to work at BorgWarner," and he tried to talk me out of it. But it was a good move for me, and so it's kind of the tale of two Millses, two different generations, and he did I think what was the right thing for him, and I did what was the right thing for me, and we both got a lot of experiences to talk about from the moves that we made.
from listening to you talk, it seems like responsible fiscal management is the key to BorgWarner's success, and that the closing of the Muncie plant, which just really exemplifies that to the extreme, where they decided it. Would you characterize it that way, that this was a smart move for them as a company to close this plant and to move on to cheaper manufacturing operations overseas or down south in non-union shops?
That's an interesting question, and I guess it's really too soon to tell how smart of a decision that was. But I will say this, and this is something that I really take away from my days at BorgWarner and my days at General Motors, and that is that it takes two sides to agree to a contract that's a bad contract. And, the union never got anything that the company didn't agree to give them. Obviously, there were lots of things in play at the time that caused those decisions to get made. But I think just in general, you can't necessarily blame the union. You can't necessarily blame the company. And one thing that I have, as I've moved on to other management roles and other companies, I have all of this history in my mind and all of this recall of bad decisions that were made that I hang on to vehemently in my current position, because I know once you start going the wrong way, it snowballs. And it's important to keep your company only focusing on the productivity side from a standpoint of doing the right things. You have to do the right things for the people. You have to provide a good environmentally based place to work. You've got to supply all the safety things so that your people are safe in the coming to work. But then when you engineer a job, when you engineer a standard to do a job, you've got to hang on to that. Just because it's hot and somebody doesn't want to do that job and they think that you can only do 200 pieces in a shift, and you think you can do, and the standard says you can do 400, you can't start saying, okay, well, you get me 300 and I'll be happy. You need to stick with what is an engineered standard, and you need to communicate to the people, hey, this is the way we got to this number, and and in some cases you may have to jump in and run those numbers yourself. And you may find out you can't run those numbers. And that was one thing that was really, really key to my learning in the strike of '89 is how many parts can you really run on these jobs? Sometimes we found out you could run a lot more. Sometimes you found out that those guys were really humping to get the numbers that they did. So, and of course, I believe in working alongside the folks. I'll go out and break relief people myself, even in the job that I'm in today. Or I'll run some parts once in a while out on the shop floor to reward someone. We'll run promotions where I'll go run their job for an hour and they take an hour lunch or something like that. Not a big deal, but I learn from that when I do those kind of things. But I think in general, I think the world economy is what sunk the plant, and it is just mentally too tough for people to decide to go from making $22 an hour to $10 an hour. Now, 5 years from now, looking back, that may have looked like a great deal then, but at the time when you're making $22 an hour and you have a lifestyle that depends on that, you're saying, I'm not going to do that. And it's all too often in companies all around this country, because of the changing global buying habits of the car companies. It's necessary. And I don't like it any better than anybody else likes it, because I think it's depleting the standard of living here in the United States. But that's what it is, and so we have to adapt.
You just talked about a little bit about the importance of experience and the things you've learned over time. If you could, did the level of experience in management change over time at BorgWarner? Were there enough senior management people that kind of had the same experience you did working on the shop floor that understood things, or were they relatively young? I'm just wondering how you could characterize management at BorgWarner, if you can at all, in terms of experience. Had they worked there long?
Yeah, for the most part, people came to BorgWarner, Warner Gear, and they worked there for a long time. Yeah, I mean, there's just I know lots of guys who worked there over 30 years. And there was a lot of newer, with the changing of time. I mean, BorgWarner was a company that started out in 1901, and so every 20, 25 years you're going to have a turn of a generation. And I happened to come in at a time when a lot of guys were getting close to the end. Maybe they had 10 years left. And so I was able to pick up from those guys 10 years worth of learning, and then, take it on from there after they were gone. And, obviously the shop floor, first line supervisor jobs, that was a job that it turned over more frequently probably. But during the years that I worked there, there was a pretty solid core of, I would say, the middle to upper management, although we had a lot of different plant managers. We had lots of different plant managers that came in. But then all the guys who reported the plant manager, there was a pretty stable group there for most of the time that I worked there.
I know we're on your lunch break, so I'll try to wrap this thing up. If I could just ask you about the significance, if you could talk a little bit about the significance of the closing, generally to the Muncie community. What do you see as how would you describe the significance of the closing to Muncie? That's a broad question. I know.
No, it's a.
Say, but
Well, I guess I would answer it by saying, just not the closing of that plant, the closing of the Chevrolet New Venture Gear plant on 8th Street and the leveling of that plant, the closing of the battery plant and the leveling of that plant. It's kind of become way too commonplace in this community. And it's, as all of these, I know people who worked at all those plants, and there's a real sense of, I don't know if it's a sense of failure, but there's certainly a sense of remorse about the fact that that building is closed. I mean, I know when I drive past BorgWarner today, one of the first things they did was they took the signs down, and that really kind of told me it was over, And I don't know if they're going to tear the plant down or what they're going to do with it, but I think. And as I circulate throughout the community and run into other guys that I've worked with, they're still a little bit, I don't think it's really settled in with them yet. I'll say, well, what are you doing? Well, I'm doing this, or sometimes I'm not doing anything. And they're young enough people that they need to find another place in life, and where they're going to find it here, I'm not sure. And so I think the community is going to miss BorgWarner for sure, not just for the financial impact that it made on the community, but also for the esteem that the people who worked there, because people who worked at BorgWarner were more proud of what they did, I believe, than any other place that I ever worked. They were very proud of the parts that they made, the assemblies that they made, the quality that they were able to achieve. And I think I'm concerned that that sense of self-esteem will leave people the further they are removed from that day when they have to walk through the door to go to work every day. And you know what the long-term impact of that is on the community and the people that live here, probably isn't going to be good and healthy for the community.
Have you already seen a lot of people move away from Muncie?
Yeah, in the years that I've lived here, I've seen a lot of, even to the point that the other day I was thinking to myself, all the guys I used to play, I end up going out and playing golf a lot by myself. And I got to thinking, all the guys I used to play golf with, they've all moved away. Some of them are up in the Chicago area, some are in the South, some of them are, out west. But yeah, I've seen, lots of people move, particularly the professional people. They tend to be a little more mobile and tend to, have to find another job and move on. Because people need to have insurance, people need to have retirement benefits, and of course, BorgWarner converted all their salary people from a defined benefit program to a defined contribution or a 401k kind of retirement program in the early 90s, mid 90s, and of course that changes your total outlook for retirement. So those of us who are in our 50s and 60s find ourselves working later in life because you still need insurance, and of course the stock market hasn't treated any of us very, very favorably. So people are going to be working later. When I started out working for General Motors in 1970, I thought for sure I'd be retired at age 55. And 7 years past 55, I'm still working. I'm going to work for another couple of years.
That's pretty much all I've got. Yes, this has been great. Is there anything you'd like to add about BorgWarner, the community that we haven't touched on today that you feel like you'd like to capture for this oral history?
No, I don't think so.
All right.
I think I'm good to go.
Well, so are we. Thanks a lot.
Okay.